let's get on to story number 300,682 of all the rubbish things that the Labour Party have done in the past year, which is the fact that because there's no spaces in prison, they're going to have to free a load of prisoners. That's right. First of all, it was just a few toe rags and, you know, bad uns and shoplifters who were popping out of jail with their mates in their Beamers, you know, coming out with their champagne like, woo, we're free, about to go on the rob again. That was bad enough, wasn't it? That was like, well, great, this isn't a good look if we're letting all these scummers out. But now, the government's latest plan, its sentencing review, it contains a raft of measures to slash the sentences served by prisoners by up to a third. And this includes sex offenders, murderers. So once upon a time, if you were convicted of serious violence or a sexual offence, you'd have to stay in prison for at least 3/4 of your jail term. I never understand why you give someone a sentence and then say, but you only have to do 3/4 of it. Why do that? Anyway, they only have to serve 3/4 of it anyway. But now that's going to be reduced to half. Oh, fantastic. Brilliant. Rapists and murderers all over the nation. Rejoice. I mean, I just can't make sense of this stuff. And, you know, if they were able, right, if they were able during those riots to jam a load of people into prison for tweets, surely there was enough space back then, wasn't there, to keep these people locked up? If they were able, during COVID, to, you know, construct these Nightingale hospitals, why on earth can't they just jig up some of the ones like Dartmoor that have been closed because apparently it needs new roof or whatever it needs? Why can't... This just spells for trouble. Let's speak to David Shipley, who himself is a former prisoner, but these days a writer and researcher on prison and justice issues. Welcome to the show, David. Now, I'm going to ask you something relatively personal about your time in Clink. I don't know whether you rubbed shoulders with any of these hard nuts. If you did, how many do you think would be up for rehabilitation, or how many deserve to have the key thrown away?
It's a great question. I think the reality is the prison system is really bad at rehabilitating people. In my experience, though, I did meet men in prison who had done really serious crimes, up to and including murder, who have changed. And I think generally what distinguishes them is they were the ones who took complete personal responsibility for what they'd done, as I did with my crime. And I think there's a lot of excuses that people come up with, a lot of mitigations, a lot of minimizations. And I think the only way you actually get to change is by completely accepting what you've done and then starting to try to be a better person.
Now, some would argue that part of the reason we've got packed prisons, part of the reason, I can think of a multitude more, is the fact that it became vogue, didn't it, for tough-speaking governments, particularly the Conservatives, to keep increasing sentences. We're going to be tough on crime, and if you perpetrate a certain act, you're now going to get even longer in jail. And so most people are like, yeah, good, that's right, that's what you should do. But they hadn't actually accounted for how many extra prison spaces this would mean if people were serving longer sentences. And we do apparently have some of the longest sentences in Europe. Do you think there's any merit to a policy where you're actually reducing some of that prison time? If you know, like you said, there are some people who are rehabilitated who probably could be let out, and everyone loves the story of rehabilitation. Or is this just blind mad?
I think the problem is not necessarily how long people spend in prison, it's what happens while they're there. And we sort of talk about long sentences if they're tough. But in most jails in the country, most prisoners spend 22 or 23 hours a day staring at daytime TV, getting bored, often getting addicted to drugs. Probably if they've got any employable skills, those skills atrophy. So that's the problem, is what happens there is really wasteful and destructive. And you're absolutely right. We've gone for longer and longer sentences. I think part of the reason for that is the police have got worse and worse at catching criminals. So if you go back 10, 15 years, maybe 15%, 20% of crimes resulted in a charge. Now it's less than 6%. So as the police catch fewer and fewer people, I think we have this kind of societal hunger to punish the ones we do catch. But actually, we'd probably do much better if we could catch more criminals and sentence them to a bit less time, but make sure they're off the streets.
A number of prisons have had to be shut down because apparently their estates are not fit for purpose. There's all sorts of issues where we're told that actually people cannot be kept in those prisons. It would be too hazardous. Do you think, why on earth are we... I mean, I know the Labour Party are now proposing to build new prisons. That's going to take time. But really, are some of these sort of mothballed prisons not able to be used?
With a number of them, the issue is they are very dangerous. And remember, it's not just that you're putting prisoners there, you're asking prison officers to work in these environments, many of which have serious fire risks. So, I think there is a good reason why some of those places aren't suitable. Dartmoor, which you mentioned, is apparently radioactive, but I'm not sure there's any significant evidence of increased cancer risks from people who've been imprisoned there. So I think that one probably could be reopened
How come
relatively
it's
quickly.
radioactive? How did that happen?
Oh, because it's in Cornwall. It's the granite, isn't it? It's like, and you get sort of slightly radioactive materials leaking into the water supply and the air, radon gas. But apparently it's at very low levels. I think essentially any old building on Dartmoor has it, so it's probably not that bad.
Wow, maybe the horses on Dartmoor all have 3 heads. I didn't know about that. I want to talk to you now also about, because one of the big issues in prisons, and if we're letting loads of people out early, we better be pretty sure that they're not wrong-uns. One of the big issues that I read about a lot happening in prisons is the amount of conversions to Islamism and the fact that Muslim gangs dominate certain prisons, so much so that the non-Muslims are the ones who have to be put into segregation. Is that also a risk if we're starting to sort of, gut and empty out our prisons back onto the streets?
I think it is, and you're absolutely right about the rise of Islamic gangs and Islamist gangs in prisons. One of the big issues there is that Islam within prison essentially forgives any crime. So, for example, sex offenders are generally ostracized and targeted in the prison system, but if they convert to Islam, they are protected by the brothers. So there are some very strong incentives to join that team. And yeah, of course, those relationships will continue after prison. I know of one man who was in Belmarsh, who came in as a young Muslim guy. He was in for a drug-related offence, nothing too senior, too serious. But he was groomed inside, and on release went and committed a terrorist attack. So this absolutely happens, and there absolutely is a risk of it.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you've clarified that for me, because that was my big fear with all of this. Is there any other way, do you think, and it's a big question to ask you because clearly the government don't have a plan, so I'm not sure whether you would be able to have one. Is there any way, we know that by November the male prison estate is full, that no more people are going to be able to go in there. Yes, we love the idea, people like me, of, if 10% of prisoners are foreign, we should just deport them. But we seem to have a bit of an issue with our lefty lawyers in this country who prevent us doing that very often. Is there any other way we could make sure that wrong-uns are banged up for the whole time they should be?
I think we'd have to spend a lot more money. And what we should do is do it the way the army do. So if you're a soldier or an airman or a seaman and you are jailed while in service, you don't go to normal prison, you go to a place called MCTC Colchester. And whereas our normal prisons have a reoffending rate of between 40 and 60%, Colchester is 9%. And what they do is they get the guys doing stuff every day. There's PT every day, there's training, there's education. If they've got addictions, they get treatment for it. And they actually work to solve the issues so that when that person's released, they're less likely to commit crime. I'm not sure there's a cheaper way of doing that. Of course, you could choose to lock everyone who's ever committed a crime up forever. Then we'd need a million prison places at a huge expense. But if we assume that most people in prison will be out within a few years, what we need to do is invest in making sure the ones who want to change have the opportunities. I think there's a missed opportunity here with the sentencing review. They were talking about the Texas model. In Texas, you could spend 100% of your sentence or more if you're a badly behaved prisoner, or as little as 25%. And that means there's a huge incentive to change. And the prisoners who don't follow the rules get punished for it. Here, we've got this very small range, 33% to 50%. I'm not sure it's a big enough incentive to drive the change they're looking for.
And what do you think about this other recommendation by Mr. Gawk, that short jail sentences of less than 12 months, which are typically imposed on burglars and thieves, will largely be scrapped? Does that essentially just give a carte blanche to someone who wants to go on the rob to carry on doing so? Because if there is no prison, then what sort of punishments are they going to face? What, a fine or something?
Yeah, I'm really concerned about this. What they've done is they've compared the reoffending rates of people who get short prison sentences with people who get community orders. And they said, oh, look, community orders have lower reoffending rates. So therefore, if we don't imprison these people, crime will come down. The reality is the people who get short prison sentences are not the same as the people who get community orders. people are not getting a short prison sentence for a first offence, or often even a fifth or a 10th offence. These are usually, as you said, prolific shoplifters, prolific thieves. And they usually have addiction issues. They've often got mental health issues. Giving them another suspended sentence or another community order is not going to fix any of that. They are likely to just carry on offending. And I think without proper investment in doing something with them when they're not in prison and some effort there, yeah, it's just going to create more crime.
And at the end of the day, this has got to be a massive slap in the face to victims, because if you're somebody who has been the victim of a serious crime, thank goodness, touch wood, I never have been. But if you are, and you wait for the day that the person who did you such wrong is put in prison, you probably want to know that they're going to stay there, that the full sentence will be served, that justice is well and truly delivered. It must be heartbreaking for some people, particularly those who've been the victims of sex crimes, to see the perpetrator regain their freedom.
Yeah, I think it is. I've just been doing an interview a few moments ago with a woman whose partner dragged her out of a car, threw her down some stairs and broke her neck. And earlier this year, before these reforms have come in, he was only sentenced to 4 months on tag, so no time in jail at all. He was on a curfew for 4 months, and that's despite the probation service assessing him at being medium to high risk of reoffending. So already victims are being really let down, and I think there is a huge concern, rightly, that, you know, particularly for these sorts of crimes against women, that there needs to be some level of punishment and protection of victims, which isn't happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think if anyone's released from prison early and goes on to commit an offence of that particular order or of any sort of gravity, the government themselves should have to pay compensation to the victim, because I think this is an absolutely appalling policy. Although, of course, when the government pays compensation, that means you and I, the taxpayer, doesn't it? David Shipley, former prisoner, writer and researcher on prison and justice issues, thank you ever so much. Oh, does that boil your blood?